There are moments in life when 3 words can shatter everything you thought you knew about yourself. For Marcus Sterling, those 3 words came not from a boardroom, not from a business rival, not from family, but from the trembling lips of a woman the world had taught to be invisible. Her name was Eleanor Grace, and she had just been humiliated in the marble lobby of the Grand Lux Hotel, accused of a crime she did not commit, stripped of her dignity in front of a crowd that watched with cold indifference. Marcus stood there, disguised in a maintenance uniform, frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as this 72-year-old woman looked up at him with eyes that held more pain than any human should carry. 3 words that would haunt him forever. But before we understand why those words destroyed him, we must go back to where it all began, to the moment a billionaire decided to abandon his empire and walk among the forgotten. Marcus Sterling was not born into wealth. He clawed his way up from nothing, from a childhood spent in shelters and soup kitchens, from nights when hunger was the only companion he knew. By the time he reached 48, he had built the Sterling Hotel empire. 27 luxury properties across the nation, each one a temple of opulence where the wealthy came to forget that poverty existed. He told himself he had earned every dollar, that his success was proof that anyone could rise above their circumstances. He believed in meritocracy, in hard work, in the idea that those who struggled simply were not trying hard enough. But then the letters started arriving. Anonymous letters, handwritten on cheap paper, describing things that should not happen in his hotels. Letters that spoke of maids worked until their bodies broke, of security guards who touched female staff in dark hallways, of managers who screamed racial slurs behind closed doors, of a tiered system where white guests received champagne while black guests received suspicion. Marcus dismissed the first letter as the work of a disgruntled employee. He dismissed the second as malicious gossip. By the 7th letter, something inside him cracked. He realized that, while he had sat in his penthouse office, sipping coffee that cost more than his employees earned in an hour, he had no idea what actually happened in the buildings that bore his name. So Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He would go undercover. He would shed his $1,000 suits and his luxury watches. He would become John Mitchell, a new maintenance worker at the Grand Lux, his flagship property, the crown jewel of his empire. His executive team protested. His lawyers warned him about liability. His wife called him foolish. But Marcus was haunted now, haunted by the possibility that his empire was built on suffering he had never bothered to see. He spent a week preparing, learning how to dress like a man who counted every dollar, studying the way working people move through the world with shoulders bent by invisible burdens. He created false employment records, a fabricated resume of odd jobs and hard times. And on a Monday morning in September, Marcus Sterling the billionaire disappeared, and John Mitchell the maintenance man was born. The first day was a shock to his system. The uniform was stiff and uncomfortable, smelling of industrial detergent. The locker room was cramped and poorly ventilated, nothing like the spa-quality facilities he had mandated for guest areas. The other employees barely acknowledged him, too exhausted from their own struggles to waste energy on yet another faceless worker. His supervisor, a man named Derek Thompson, handed him a mop and bucket with barely a word, pointing toward the service elevator that staff were required to use, because God forbid a paying guest should see the people who made their comfort possible. Marcus spent that first day mopping floors he had walked across 100 times without ever noticing the scuff marks, the places where the marble was cracking, the evidence of deferred maintenance in areas guests never saw. His back ached. His hands grew raw. And he began to understand the vast distance between the world he lived in and the world his employees inhabited. By the 3rd day, Marcus started to see the invisible architecture of cruelty that held his hotel together. He saw how the housekeeping staff were given impossible room quotas, forced to clean 30 rooms in an 8-hour shift, which meant less than 16 minutes per room, including bathroom, bedroom, and all surfaces. He saw how they were denied bathroom breaks, forced to hold their bladders for hours or risk falling behind. He saw how the break room had a broken refrigerator that management had ignored for 6 months, forcing employees to eat spoiled food or go hungry. He saw how the scheduling system was deliberately chaotic, posted only 2 days in advance, making it impossible for single parents to arrange childcare or for students to plan their classes. He saw the way managers spoke to staff in tones dripping with contempt, the way security guards profiled black employees with random bag checks that white employees never faced, the way the HR department dismissed every complaint as exaggeration or lies. But it was not until the 8th day that Marcus met Eleanor Grace, and everything he thought he understood about injustice was revealed as merely the surface of something far deeper and more terrible. He was cleaning the lobby restrooms when he heard her voice for the first time, soft and melodic, humming an old spiritual as she polished the brass railings with careful precision. She was a small woman, her hair silver white beneath her uniform cap, her dark skin creased with lines that spoke of 7 decades of labor and loss. Her hands moved with the grace of someone who took pride in her work, despite everything, who found dignity in tasks the world dismissed as beneath notice. Marcus watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the way other employees greeted her with genuine warmth, the way even the hardest and most cynical workers softened when they saw her. She had worked at the Grand Lux for 43 years, he would later learn, longer than anyone else, a living piece of the building's history that no one in management had ever bothered to honor. Eleanor noticed him watching and smiled. A smile that reached her tired eyes and made something in Marcus's chest tighten with an emotion he could not name. She walked over slowly, her gait careful, and introduced herself with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to belong to a gentler time. She asked him about himself, about where he came from, about whether he was settling in all right, and her questions were not mere politeness but genuine concern. The interest of someone who knew what it meant to be new and alone in alone. A place that did not care whether you lived or died. Marcus found himself lying, spinning the story of John Mitchell, but even as the falsehoods left his mouth, he felt the weight of her kindness, the way she listened as though his invented struggles mattered, as though he mattered. When she left to continue her rounds, Marcus stood there feeling like a fraud, feeling the shame of his deception burning in his gut. Over the following days, Marcus learned Eleanor's story in pieces, gathered from conversations with other employees during brief moments in the break room or the service corridors where management never ventured. Eleanor had started working at the Grand Lux when it first opened in 1982, when she was 29. Years old and desperate for any job that would feed her 3 children after her husband died in an industrial accident. Back then, the hotel was independently owned by a family that knew every employee by name, that threw Christmas parties and gave bonuses and treated their staff like human beings. But the hotel had changed hands 5 times over the decades, each new owner more concerned with profit margins than people. Each one cutting benefits and raising quotas and creating distance between management and workers. Eleanor had endured it all, had watched friends fired for getting sick, had seen young people crushed under debt, had witnessed the slow transformation of dignified work into desperate survival. She stayed because at her age, with her lack of formal education, no one else would hire her. She stayed because her granddaughter was in college, the first in their family to go, and Eleanor was helping pay the tuition. She stayed because quitting felt like admitting defeat, like letting them win. Marcus found himself seeking out Eleanor during his shifts, drawn to her in ways he did not fully understand. She reminded him of his own grandmother, The woman who had raised him after his mother abandoned him. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep him fed and clothed and hopeful. His grandmother had died when Marcus was 17, worked literally to death by a system that consumed poor people and spat out their bones. Marcus had built his empire telling himself it was for her, telling himself she would be proud. But now, looking at Eleanor, he wondered if his grandmother would recognize the man he had become. Would she be proud of someone who had created the very conditions that once destroyed her? Would she see his success as redemption or as betrayal? The moment that changed everything happened on a Friday afternoon, during the busiest time of the day when the lobby was filled with arriving guests and bustling activity. Marcus was replacing light bulbs in the decorative fixtures high up on a ladder when he heard the commotion. A woman's voice, shrill with accusation, cut through the refined atmosphere like breaking glass. He looked down to see a white woman in an expensive dress, dripping with air. Jewelry, pointing at Eleanor and shrieking about theft. The woman claimed that a diamond bracelet worth $50,000 had disappeared from her hotel room, and she was certain that the maid who cleaned her room that morning was the thief. That maid was Eleanor. Marcus watched in horror as the scene unfolded below him. The hotel manager, a man named Richard Blackwell, whom Marcus had personally promoted 2 years earlier, rushed over with security guards in tow. Blackwell did not ask Eleanor for her side of the story. He did not question the guest or investigate the claim. Instead, he immediately grabbed Eleanor by the arm, his fingers digging into her thin flesh, and began marching her toward the back offices while barking orders for security to search her locker. The guest continued her tirade, her voice growing louder and more vicious with each word, and Marcus realized with sickening clarity that she was enjoying this, that the humiliation of a black maid was entertainment for her, proof of her own superiority. Other guests had stopped to watch, their faces reflecting curiosity and judgment, but no sympathy, no question of whether the accusation might be false, because people like Eleanor were always guilty in their eyes, guilty of being poor, guilty of being black, guilty of existing in spaces they were only meant to serve. Eleanor did not resist. She did not protest or defend herself. She simply walked with her head bowed, her shoulders trembling, and Marcus saw in her posture the accumulated weight of every injustice she had ever endured, every time she had been treated as less than human, every moment when she had been forced to swallow her dignity to keep her job. The other employees watched helplessly, their faces reflecting rage and sorrow. But none of them moved to help because they knew that defending Eleanor meant losing their own jobs. And they could not afford martyrdom when they had children to feed and rent, pay duty. The system was designed this way, Marcus realized, designed to isolate and terrorize workers, to make resistance impossible by threatening the very survival of anyone who dared to speak. Marcus climbed down from the ladder slowly, his hands shaking, his mind racing. This was his hotel. These were his employees. This was happening because of decisions he had made, policies he had approved, managers he had empowered. He could stop this with a single word, could reveal his identity and end Eleanor's humiliation instantly. But something held him back, some instinct that told him he needed to see this through, needed to witness the full horror of what he had created, because if he stopped it now, he would never truly understand. So he followed the crowd toward the back offices, his heart pounding, his conscience screaming. The security office was cramped and windowless, designed to be intimidating. Eleanor stood in the center of the room while security guards dumped the contents of her locker onto a table, pouring through her meager possessions with rough hands. Her lunch in a worn plastic container, a cardigan with patched elbows, a small photo album with pictures of her grandchildren, a Bible So old the leather cover was, falling apart. A bottle of arthritis medication. There was no bracelet. Marcus, standing in the doorway with other employees who had gathered to witness, felt relief wash over him. Surely this would end now. Surely Blackwell would apologize and let Eleanor return to work. But Blackwell was not satisfied. He ordered the guards to perform a full-body search, to check her pockets, her shoes, even the hem of her uniform dress. The female security guard, her face expressionless, began patting down Eleanor in a manner that was deliberately humiliating, invasive, violating. Eleanor stood there taking it, her eyes closed, tears streaming silently down her weathered face, and Marcus realized she was praying, whispering scripture under her breath, clinging to her faith as the only thing they could not take from her. Still no bracelet. And still Blackwell would not relent. He accused Eleanor of hiding it somewhere, of passing it to an accomplice, his voice growing more aggressive with each failed attempt to prove her guilt, because admitting he was wrong meant losing face in front of subordinates and guests. Then Blackwell made his fatal mistake. Frustrated and embarrassed, he grabbed Eleanor by the shoulders and shook her, screaming into her face that she would confess, or he would call the police and have her arrested, that she would rot in jail where she belonged, that people like her always stole, because it was in their nature. The words echoed in the small room, vile and naked in their racism, and something inside Marcus shattered. He saw his grandmother in Eleanor's face. He saw every person who had ever been crushed by the powerful. He saw the truth of his own complicity, his own guilt. And he could not stay silent anymore. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his body moving on instinct, putting himself between Blackwell and Eleanor. His voice, when he spoke, was low and deadly calm, the voice of a man who had built an empire through force of will. He told Blackwell to let her go. Blackwell, not recognizing the maintenance worker before him, snarled at Marcus to mind his own business, or be fired alongside the thief. Marcus did not move. The room had gone silent, everyone sensing that something profound was shifting, that the usual order of things was about to be upended. Marcus looked past Blackwell to Eleanor, meeting her eyes for the first time since this nightmare began, and what he saw there nearly broke him. She was looking at him with such gratitude, such desperate hope, as though his small act of defiance was the first kindness anyone had shown her in years. And then Eleanor spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from crying, but in the shocked silence of that room, her words rang clear. She looked at Marcus, at this stranger who had stepped forward when no one else would, and she said 3 words that stopped time. I forgive you. 3 words. I forgive you. Not thank you. Not help me. But I forgive you. As though Marcus were the one who needed forgiveness. As though she could see through his disguise and into his soul, and knew exactly who he was and what he had done. As though she understood that he was responsible for this moment, for every moment like this, for the entire system that had brought them both to this place. And instead of accusing him, instead of cursing him, she offered him forgiveness. Marcus felt the words enter him like a knife made of light, cutting through every lie he had told himself, every justification he had built, every wall he had constructed between himself and the suffering of others. He understood in that instant that Eleanor was not just forgiving him for this moment but for everything, for 43 years of fall, minimum wage and maximum indignity, for policies that treated human beings as expendable resources, for a world that had taught her that her pain did not matter, and the fact that she could forgive him, that she could offer grace when she had been offered none, revealed the vast distance between her moral universe and his own. He had built towers of steel and glass, had accumulated more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, had convinced himself that success was the measure of a man's worth. But this woman, who owned almost nothing, who had been stripped of her dignity by people who worked for him, possessed something he had lost long ago, or perhaps never had at all. She possessed the kind of profound humanity that could look at cruelty and respond with compassion, that could see her oppressor and offer him redemption. Marcus could not speak. His throat had closed, his eyes burned with tears he had not shed in decades. His hands trembled with the force of emotions he did not know how to name. Around him, the other employees were staring, sensing that something extraordinary was happening, but not understanding what. Blackwell was still talking, still making threats, still asserting his authority, but his voice seemed to come from very far away, insignificant and hollow. Marcus reached out slowly and took Eleanor's hand, her fingers fragile and cold in his grasp. And he made a decision that would change everything. He turned to face Blackwell, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer that of John Mitchell, the maintenance worker, but of Marcus Sterling, the owner, carrying authority that made Blackwell's bluster evaporate like morning mist. Marcus told him to be silent. He told the security guards to step back. He told everyone in the room that they were about to witness what happens when power is confronted with truth. Then Marcus reached up and removed the maintenance uniform cap he had been wearing, revealing his face fully for the first time. And he watched recognition dawn in Blackwell's eyes, followed by pure terror. The revelation sent shockwaves through the building. Within minutes, news spread through the employee network that the owner had been working among them in disguise, that he had witnessed everything, that judgment had come. The wealthy guest who had made the accusation suddenly remembered where she had left her bracelet, conveniently discovering it in her own suitcase, offering stammering apologies that fooled no one. Blackwell tried to explain, to justify, to blame subordinates and circumstances, but Marcus cut him off with a gesture. He fired Blackwell on the spot, told him to collect his belongings and leave immediately, told him that he would ensure no other hotel in the Sterling Empire or beyond would ever hire him. The security guards who had participated in Eleanor's humiliation were fired. The HR manager, who had ignored complaints for years, was fired. Marcus called an emergency meeting of all staff, standing before them not as their boss but as a man who had failed them, and he told them the truth. He told them that he had been blind, that he had built his empire on their backs without acknowledging their humanity, that the system he created was designed to extract maximum labor for minimum compensation, that he was guilty of every sin they could name. And he promised change. But promises from the powerful mean nothing without action, and Marcus knew this. Over the following weeks, he transformed the Grand Lux from the inside out. He raised the minimum wage for all employees to $25 an hour, a 50% increase that sent shockwaves through the hospitality industry. He reduced housekeeping quotas to 15 rooms per shift, bringing them in line with what human bodies could actually endure. He hired more staff to cover the difference, creating jobs where there had been exploitation. He renovated the employee break rooms and locker rooms to match the quality of guest areas, because people deserved beauty and comfort, regardless of which side of the service divide they inhabited. He created a genuine complaint system, independent of management, where workers could report abuse without fear of retaliation. He fired every manager who had a history of discrimination or cruelty, and he hired new leaders from the ranks of longtime employees who understood what it meant to be treated as disposable. He established a profit-sharing system, distributing 15% of hotel earnings among staff, turning workers into stakeholders. He created a scholarship fund for employees and their families, fully funded, no strings attached. And he did something else, something that cost him nothing financially but everything emotionally. He made Eleanor Grace the director of staff relations, a new position with real authority, real power, a voice in every decision that affected employees. She tried to refuse, saying she was too old, too uneducated, too unqualified. But Marcus insisted, telling her that she was the most qualified person he knew because she understood what it meant to be invisible, and that understanding was worth more than any business degree. Eleanor accepted, and she became the conscience of the Sterling Empire, the person who ensured that policies looked good not just on paper but in practice, who held management accountable, who gave workers someone they could trust. The changes spread beyond the grand looks. Marcus implemented the same reforms across all 27 Sterling properties, forcing his executive team to adapt or resign. Many resigned, telling him he was destroying his own company, that competition would crush him, that investors would flee. But something unexpected happened. Employee turnover, which had cost the company millions in recruitment and training, dropped to nearly zero. Productivity increased because workers who felt valued worked better. Guest satisfaction scores rose. Because guests could sense when a hotel ran on exploitation versus when it ran on mutual respect. Stories about the Sterling transformation went viral, generating publicity that no marketing campaign could buy. Young people, the demographic that increasingly cared about ethical consumption, began choosing Sterling hotels specifically because of their labor practices. Within a year, profits had actually increased, proving that treating people with dignity was not just moral, but good business. But the real transformation was not in balance sheets or market share. It was in the lives of people who had been invisible. It was in the single mother who could now afford childcare and stopped bringing her daughter to work. It was in the college student who could pay tuition without drowning in debt. It was in the older workers like Eleanor who no longer had to choose between medication and food. It was in the simple fact that people who spent their days cleaning toilets and hauling trash were now treated as though their labor had value, as though their lives mattered, as though their humanity was not contingent on their economic utility. Marcus's marriage ended. His wife, who had fallen in love with the ruthless businessman, could not accept the man he had become. Many of his wealthy friends abandoned him, viewing his transformation as betrayal of their class. Industry publications ran articles questioning his sanity, predicting his empire's collapse. But Marcus found he did not care. He had discovered something more valuable than wealth or status, or the approval of people whose respect was based on shared cruelty. He had discovered what it meant to live with integrity, to use power in service of justice rather than exploitation. He had discovered that the hunger in his stomach as a child had taught him nothing about poverty if he then spent his adulthood creating systems that starved others. And he had discovered Eleanor Grace. She became his mentor, his guide, his reminder of what mattered when the business world tried to pull him back toward familiar patterns. They met weekly, these two people from opposite sides of every divide, and she taught him things no business school had ever mentioned. She taught him that dignity could not be given, only recognized or denied. She taught him that poverty was not failure but circumstance, and that wealth was not virtue but luck, and sometimes theft. She taught him that every person contained vast universes of hopes and fears and dreams, and that seeing those universes was the only thing that separated civilization from barbarism. She taught him that forgiveness was not weakness, but the highest form of strength, the ability to acknowledge harm without being consumed by hatred. Marcus often thought about those three words. I forgive you. He came to understand that Eleanor had not been forgiving him for the specific moment of her humiliation, but for something larger, for the entire structure of a world that sorted human beings into categories of worth, based on accidents of birth and circumstance. She forgave him for being born into that world, and accepting its rules without question. She forgave him for climbing its ladder by stepping on others. She forgave him for his blindness, his selfishness, his complicity. But her forgiveness did not absolve him. If anything, it made his responsibility heavier, because she had shown him that another way was possible, that he could choose differently, and now he had to live with the weight of that knowledge. Years passed. The sterling empire continued to thrive, proving that ethical business was not an oxymoron. Other hotel chains began copying Marcus's reforms, not out of moral conviction, but because they had to compete. Slowly, incrementally, the industry changed, and millions of workers found their lives improved. Eleanor lived to see her granddaughter graduate from college, become a lawyer, and take a job defending workers' rights. She lived to see real change, to know that her suffering had not been meaningless. And when she died, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 79, Marcus wept at her funeral with the same abandon he had learned that day in the security office, because she had taught him that tears were not weakness but proof of humanity. At her funeral, Marcus spoke to the hundreds of people who had gathered, workers and executives and family and friends, and he told them about the 3 words that had changed his life. He told them that Eleanor Grace had possessed a moral clarity that revealed the bankruptcy of everything he had been taught about success and value. He told them that she had forgiven him when he deserved only condemnation, and that her grace had demanded he become worthy of it. He told them that every day he woke up trying to honor her memory, by remembering that no human being was invisible, that every person mattered infinitely, that how we treat the most vulnerable among us is the only measure of our civilization that matters. The sterling hotel empire still exists today. Every employee receives a living wage, comprehensive benefits, and genuine respect. Every hotel lobby displays a portrait of Eleanor Grace alongside the company's mission statement, which reads simply, "Every person deserves dignity." Marcus Sterling never remarried, never accumulated more wealth than he needed, never forgot where he came from or what he had learned. He spent the rest of his life trying to build a world where no one would ever have to forgive what Eleanor forgave, because the systems that created such cruelty would no longer exist. This is not a story about redemption, because redemption is too clean, too simple for the complexity of what happened. This is a story about what it means to truly see another human being. To recognize that the hierarchies we create are lies we tell ourselves to justify indifference to suffering. This is a story about 3 words that contained more truth than 1,000 business plans, more wisdom than $1 million, more power than any empire. I forgive you. Words spoken by a woman who had every right to curse, to condemn, to destroy. Words that chose grace instead of vengeance, understanding instead of hatred, hope instead of despair. If this story has touched something inside you, if you have felt the weight of Eleanor's words and Marcus's transformation, then you understand what these stories are truly about. They are not entertainment. They are mirrors held up to our world, asking us to see the invisible people around us, to question the systems we participate in, to recognize our own complicity in structures of cruelty, and to believe that change is possible if we are willing to be changed ourselves. Every person you pass on the street carries a story as complex and profound as your own. Every worker you barely notice is someone's grandmother, someone's mother, someone's daughter. Every act of kindness or cruelty ripples outward in ways we cannot measure. And every one of us is making a choice, every day, about what kind of world we want to create. Share this story if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that forgiveness is possible, that change is possible, that we are not trapped in the roles society assigns us. Subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away from injustice, that insist on the dignity of every human being, that believe in our capacity to be better than we are. Because every story hides a truth, and every truth deserves to be heard.